Hi, this is Geoff Berry, and welcome to the Nature Calling channel, where we aim to deepen connection to the earth and to the spirit of life and to all our kin on this beautiful planet. Thank you very much, Mary-Jayne Rust, eco-psychologist from the UK, and as I've just discovered, from just in the north of London. For joining me to chat about ecotherapy, eco-psychology, how we are going in the world. And as you've just shared, I hadn't realised you have spent some time in Australia. And
a long time ago.
Okay.
In around 2003, 2004, I decided to take a break from my practice, and I spent some time traveling in India, and then spent 3 months in Australia. It seems like such a luxury now because, of course, I didn't go overland. I flew to those places, which I don't think I would do these days.
Okay.
But anyway, it was an extraordinary breakout. And actually, one of the things that really I really fell in love with forests in a big way in Australia, in a way that I realised I never have done, because I grew up near the sea. I've always been a coast person. I will always go to the beach if I have a choice.
Yeah.
But in New South Wales, inland from Byron Bay, I met some forests who were extraordinary beings. And I think probably all the more extraordinary because some of them had been saved by a group of people which included John Seed. So you could actually see the areas, you could see where the loggers had gone in all those years ago. So it was very, very moving to be in those areas. But I mean, just such a sense of being in the tropics and the heat and the ferns, the tree ferns and the pythons and the monitor lizards and the kind of, I mean, I felt like I was in some millions of years ago, primeval forest.
I have had that experience in Australian forests, particularly down in Tassie, where I felt genuinely timeless in a way I rarely feel otherwise. And you actually mentioned that that trip, which was around about 20 years ago, I think you mentioned something like it was a part of you wondering, or it was you were working out how you were going to integrate a nature practice into your psychotherapy practice. Did you get inspiration from India and Australia in the way that you were going to do that?
Well, who would have thought, really? I mean, I thought I was a bit like the Joker, kind of throwing all my cards into the air at that point. Why am I doing this? I'd been in an eco-psychology group for 5 years, and really that was my training, if you like. I mean, I'd done a training as an art therapist, and then I'd worked at the Women's Therapy Centre with women with eating problems. And that was actually quite seminal for me because I began to understand, just from the personal to the collective, what it means to live in a consumer society, as if we're all living in a giant eating problem.
That's maybe not so far from a metaphor that could be fruitful.
Well, exactly. So I gained a lot of insight from that work. I was also working in a men's prison at the time, so it was very interesting, this sort of two extraordinarily different institutions of a men's prison, and very hierarchical and strict and everything locked up, and a women's collective. And of course, I was working with the abusers and the abused, but of course the abusers were also the abused.
Yeah.
So that was a very interesting time. And then I spent some time in Ladakh, and that was when it really hit me, the ecological crisis, sort of from knowing about it to really feeling it.
Yeah.
And then I came back, and in fact, I had just been reading Joanna Macy while I was traveling, and discovered the field of eco-psychology, which was absolutely amazing because it brought so many different threads of my life together. And it made sense of why I wasn't quite happy with this sort of rather urbanized version of psychotherapy, even though all of that was very interesting. Ecopsychology was just like really opened the doors to seeing things in a much, much wider frame. And I met a number of other therapists who felt the same, and we met once a month for 5 years. Reading together, sharing our experiences, experimenting with workshop ideas. And it was during that time, actually, that I then went to residentials. Sometimes we went, a few of us together, to John Seed residentials and Joanna Macy residentials, which was a lovely thing to do as a group.
That was in the UK there still? That
was in the UK. So John used to come over every year. And Joanna came over quite a few times. So that they were really such important mentors to me in the early days. But it still really flummoxed me, really, as to how to bring this into my individual practice. At certain points, I thought maybe I should give up working one-to-one, because group work is so powerful in this respect. It's so important to build community. But I'm not really. I really love the one-to-one work. I really love it. And so it didn't seem like a very logical path to go off to spend time in India and Australia. But in fact, what happened was that I just totally let go. I was with the dawn and the dusk every single day in the Himalayas and traveling around different parts of India. And I don't know if you've been there, but, it is a place where you are challenged to let go on many different levels. And then coming to Australia and spending time with John Seed and his community, and a woman called Helena Norberg Hodge, who I'd spent time with in Ladakh, and her very important work, book Ancient Futures, is still well worth reading, even though it was written quite a long time ago. And when I got home, so I just didn't think about any of it really for 7 months. And I got home and it was surprisingly easy to pick up the threads. And I tell you, the phone started to ring, inviting me to come and speak here and there. And
around the nature connection as well. So really ecopsychology. It's opened up.
It was, and I think it was because I was fully charged. I was so fully charged. And I was so enthusiastic, a bit like the tarot card, the Fool. I've been on this kind of rather foolish journey, and I come back and I just felt like saying yes to everything. I'd got energy. And really from the other than human world had given me so much energy. And so I just started speaking at conferences, and then that led to more invitations. And then very gradually, and it was very gradual, I started to piece together how this would come into my own practice. I also started working with an outdoor educator, Dave Key, who I met just before I left on those travels. And when I came back, we had agreed we would start to work together. And so we were running groups on the west coast of Scotland, really with an intention to deepen our connection with the other than human world and the land, in the hope that this would somehow further some sort of shift in worldview and change in people's lives, but also in people's work. And I think it was that work in Scotland, which was group work, obviously, that led me then to take the next step of taking my practice outdoors.
Right.
A client spontaneously asked me one day, because people started to hear that I was doing this, and she just said, can we start meeting outdoors? And we talked about it for quite a long time. And then we just took the step, and then it became much more obvious to me.
Brilliant. Wow. So really, you were inventing it as you went along, weren't you?
I was totally inventing it. Yeah. I mean, there were just a handful of people in this country at that time who were also experimenting with it. But, in around 2004, I was still afraid of being struck off.
Sure.
For working outdoors.
It was still quite that radical.
Yeah. So I had to go very carefully and watch out who I said what to whom.
Well, sorry, you keep going.
Well, until I realized that actually I was practicing ecotherapy, and so therefore it shouldn't be under the same rules and regulations as psychotherapy.
Sure, but it's also kind of validated because it has a name and it's not just something you're making up.
Exactly.
Well, funnily enough, you've jumped to one of the prompts I've sent you. So if I may, we'll just cut to that one because, one of the things we have to work with, and you also mentioned this about living in North London, you've got a butte block there, you can see the tree out the back and so forth. But as you say, thank you. As you say, to get to any kind of wilderness that's not bound fairly closely by an urban environment, you would have to travel some distance. And even in Australia, we're highly urbanized people, even though we have so much country, as the Aboriginal Australian people call it, all around us. So, do you also sometimes bring nature in? Have you worked out ways to work with nature, both taking clients out and also introducing the idea of their connection to nature just in a room? I think a lot of people are really interested in that, how we do it when we can't go bush.
Well, it's interesting because I'm what can I say, cautious, or I don't want there to be this big split between outdoors and indoors in the ecopsychology world. I don't think it's helpful. Of course, I believe it's helpful to take the work outdoors because we're so used to being indoors.
Just to break it down, yeah.
And there's a whole lot of things that you get, you have animals and plants and the other than human world and the wind, it joins you in the session. Yeah. So it becomes a third, if you like. You're actually working with the real live relationship. But of course, we are in nature all the time. We are in nature when we're indoors as well. So I think there's many, many ways in which this work comes into the regular work in a more traditional setting. I mean, I have a fire, a wood burning stove in the room. So it's very nice. Sometimes I don't use it very often, actually, because we've insulated the attic, and so it gets boiling hot now when I use the fire, which is quite funny. But people bring dreams where they are having relationships with animals or plants or going to different places. People talk about those experiences. They go on holidays, or they may have transformational experiences between sessions outdoors. And I may draw that out, if someone is obviously interested in working like that. It's possible to suggest something at the end of a session, or maybe you could try this between sessions. I don't usually, exactly, homework. I don't usually start out with those kinds of suggestions. I wait for it to emerge in the client relationship.
Okay.
But there's also things like, what happened in someone's childhood. Usually people have had, well, not usually, but many people have had relationships with animals growing up. Yeah. That may be their first experience of death and grief, which is really vital, which often gets missed in traditional psychotherapy. People may have moved from one place to another, or from one country to another, and there may be a lot of unprocessed grief around that, because we're not very good at recognizing our grief for the other than human world. And then, of course, there's a raft of stuff around what was your mother's relationship to the other than human world like, and your father's and your ancestors.
Yeah.
Was there major trauma in the family history that hasn't been recognized? I mean, there's just so much here, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lot. And I think you're right. I think clearly we're not trained or socialized or enculturated very well to sit in discomfort. I mean, it's not something capitalism wants you to do. It wants you to leap out of discomfort immediately.
Yeah.
But to do so, and I find it uncomfortable. I'm trying to get better at sitting in grief. For me, anger, a bit of a problem. And sometimes, of course, you have to also see it's a good energy in a lot of ways. We should be angry at, for instance, the way the world's going and what the capitalist destruction machine's doing. So getting to know those darker places, to use that metaphor, or more difficult energies, yeah, super important. And the fact that our relationship with the environment's not something we process, or our parents, as you say, our ancestors, our entire culture is just, separated from nature and unprocessed in that relationship. So
exactly. And then, of course, the all important peak experiences, or a sense of the transpersonal that people can connect with when they're outdoors. So there's so many different kinds of experiences that often don't get included.
Yeah, and
aren't seen as important because, for someone that might be not, there's the sort of more everyday spending time out in the forest behind here is very soothing, and it balances my emotions and it puts things into perspective. There's a raft of things that stimulates the imagination, but there can also be some really major experiences that get lost around a glimpse into non-duality for someone.
I'm with you. And I think it was actually John Seed that woke me up to something like this in the 90s when he asked a big workshop of people who had had a powerful experience in nature as a child alone. And you know what happened? Like nearly everyone had. That was the reason we were there. So not too surprising. But what it helped me to do, it was that it helped me to place that. It normalized the fact that I'd had transpersonal experiences in nature. And I thought, oh, look at all these other people. It was just that we weren't talking about it. But a lot of people have had those kinds of peak or just very special, meaningful experiences. And just by opening up the conversation, I felt like that matured a lot of us into a relationship with more than human nature, rather than a idea or a confusion or a recognition that something exists but we don't quite know what it is, how to work. And then, luckily we still have living traditional cultures, especially in this country with the Aboriginal Australian people, as well as all the anthropological literature and the myths and symbols, which is my specific area of interest, that remind us that this is normal. It's got to be normalized, having a relationship with more than human nature. As soon as it is, you start doing it and it makes sense. And then you actually build the relationships and you feel connected again. Good ways. Oh,
it's very difficult though, isn't it? I was thinking, how one goes over these really fundamental questions in this field. For me, one of the fundamental questions is, we're disconnected from nature and we need to reconnect. I mean, I get a little bit irritated with that terminology because, you can't ever be disconnected from nature. We need to breathe.
Separation straight away.
So it's an illusion, isn't it? But it is also true that we have withdrawn from our daily lives, being completely immersed in the rest of nature. In the way that our ancestors would have been, completely embedded. And then the question arises, so what does it really mean for us in our modern lives? Is it just a little bit of tinkering around the edges? What does it mean for me? I do spend at least a couple of hours out there each day. I make sure I need that for my physical and mental health. but it's a very different kind of, it's not like a working relationship anymore. If you know what I mean. So I think it raises a really big question here.
Would you call it a loving relationship?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I feel totally in love. And I think it's a very important source. It's like plugging into source, really, for me, and plugging into love and beauty. I think it's different for different people, but for me, beauty is a really important portal into an experience of what I would call a kind of everyday ecstasy, a sense of really being in love with life and in love with the world. So when I go to a place, there's a series of ponds on a place called Hampstead Heath, which is not that far from where I live. And it's actually, it's fed by a spring. And so it's a river that's been created but sort of 150 years ago. A set of ponds have been made. So the water is flowing through them.
Nice.
There's one for women, there's one for men, and then there's a mixed pond.
Okay.
And they are really beautiful places. I mean, they're not huge, but they are available all year round. So this year I've been through the winter, which is quite an extraordinary experience, swimming in the ice and so on. And it's become a really big thing now, of course, wild swimming. So
yes.
It's good to see. It's sort of good to see them really. Lots and lots of people wanting to come and do this, although I do have to laugh, this winter having to queue to get into 3-degree water.
Icy water. That's crazy. Well, look, it's, I do feel for you because I get what you mean. Where I live, it's quite a wild coast. I swim in the ocean year round. It doesn't get that cold.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it gets down to, 11 or 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's also a very, very long beach in a very lightly populated area. So there's rarely anyone else swimming in it in winter. And I have to admit that I'm selfishly pleased about that.
Yes.
And there's virtually no fear that, I'm ever going to get crowded out, which is great. But it is funny. Look, well, funny. It's also great that something like that, swimming in cold immersion in nature, is more popular. People are moving towards, I think, a bigger, a wider, a broader acceptance that we need to regenerate our relationships with nature. And you've written about this a couple of times. Is it okay if we pick up a couple of those threads?
Sure. I just wanted to add actually what we were talking about, how vital that is for people in the city.
Yeah.
And it's a really, I realise I'm terribly lucky to live in this particular part of town, but I would love to see that sort of thing available for people in cities around the world. It's so important. It's so important that the cities are greened.
And London's not too bad, right? For parks.
It's not too bad. It's not. It's
like
pretty
that.
good.
I've had very, very helpful experiences in both Melbourne and Sydney, the two places I've worked most, where in a CBD area where I've had some difficult work to do, either working with traumatized children or working in the therapeutic fields, where I've just had to go out and sit under a tree. And I cannot believe the changing consciousness you can achieve in 10 minutes under a tree if you really let it happen, even with the traffic right there. It's not, you don't need that pristine wilderness, actually.
Exactly. And also research shows, I didn't realise this until quite recently, that it lowers crime. To actually attend to the green areas of a city lowers crime. I find that amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something going on there that's less, I want to say less than rational. It's beneath the rational. It's somehow subliminal. And you mentioned beauty. I had to come to realize that I was an aesthetic philosopher in a certain sense, that I respond to beauty and I don't like ugliness. And often ugliness is a built environment that's fallen into disrepair. And beauty is a natural environment that's still a robust ecosystem. It's hard not to make that it sounds a bit dualistic, but sometimes you just have to admit
Yeah.
what you prefer.
Yeah.
And I can't remember who it was that said, it might have been Leopold or Arne Ness that said something about, what is good is what supports a complex biodiverse ecosystem.
Yeah.
And what is
Yes.
bad doesn't support that. And I thought, that's calling it, that's making a stand that I can appreciate. Anyway, thank you so far. Like you've opened up a lot of beauty and your loving relationship with nature and the way that you've evolved that into a practice. So I think, regardless of what else we might get through here, I feel like a lot of people will get a lot out of that. Thanks so far, Mary-Jayne. But I mentioned too off air before we started a couple of things I'd read of yours, and I thought we might pick up on a couple of points that I also think people would still would really value reconnecting with. And one of them was your idea that we need an earth connected self. And I do think this is something that's, become a more popular ideal. I mean, even corporate people living a largely urban lifestyle nowadays, it's almost kind of mainstream to think about. Not quite, but it's becoming more popular. Where has that gone for you since I read about that first in Linda Buzzell and Craig Chalquist's ecotherapy anthology, Earth Connected Self. You've kind of started talking about it.
Yes, I've started talking about one of the practices that I hold very dear. So it's about actually having just a few places locally that are very dear to me. I find it's like now visiting an old friend when I go to these particular places. The pond I've mentioned, and I've said, well, it's getting a little bit crowded, but it's also lovely that it's not just me on my own. It is lovely that there's other women who are really. I always love it in the spring when you get the first few warm days and everyone is swimming around there with grins from ear to ear. Everyone is just so happy to be in the water. But there's other places too. So I live right by a forest, and so there are particular trees who I like to visit. But it's not just even about being indoors. It's about a particular consciousness that I'm, in a sense, trying to be aware of as I go through the day. That what food am I buying? Where does it come from? Looking at the food on my plate at lunchtime, how connected am I to all the beings and peoples who have created this in order that it can come to my plate? How much food can I grow in our quite small city garden? And it's also worldview, attending to my language, noticing how the other than human world is always called it and which, relegating them to objects and trying to maintain awareness around that and changing it. And it always makes people a little bit surprised when I refer to a tree as who. The tree who I met, not that I met.
Very good. Just taking away that depersonalizing habit.
I think it's quite a big one in terms of our language. And trying to change that going out into nature phrase, which I think trips us up all the time, and because it's so dualistic. But our alternatives are so clunky and they can often sound pretentious, talking about the other than human world to people who aren't aware of the field of ecopsychology. It's tricky. I am really amazed and surprised and happy that there are things coming into mainstream culture. Things are changing. So, and I've been really trying to look at this recently. What are the things that are changing? Can we track this from maybe even James Lovelock naming the whole Earth system as Gaia, so suddenly the Earth, which was seen as a bunch of biological resources, is now personalized. And on from there, there's so many changes that are happening, including the rights for nature, including new laws recognizing the sentience of animals, rewilding, which I think is a really big one, has really taken off in this country. I don't know about Australia.
Oh, it's massive here. In fact, I'm slightly surprised because I see it as happening in Australia as something really natural because we like the outdoors and, we're that kind of people. Yeah, rewilding in Australia naturally. You wouldn't do that in England, too cold over there. What's the rewilding movement look like in the UK?
Well, it's very interesting. There's a big estate, which I think is about 3,000 acres, not far from London, called the Knepp Estate, Knepp, owned by Lord and Lady, whoever. But what's so great is that this particular Lord and Lady understand rewilding and saw that their soil was getting very degraded in the late 90s and started to make huge changes and have turned their entire estate over to rewilding.
Right.
And there's a woman called Isabella Tree. She has written a book about their journey.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to read the resistance that they come up against in the early days, how people were just thought it was outrageous that land shouldn't be used, shouldn't be seen as productive. But, I think at the center of it is really giving something back to nature, which of course nature has always had, that nature has an intelligence and her own order, and can regenerate when she's given half a chance, when she's just allowed to do it for herself.
Indeed, same as ourselves, you might say.
And it's, it's now, because of this huge project and because of it being so close to London, it's become very well known, and actually it's been incredibly successful. Like lots of really rare species are returning. Like a white stork. This was on mainstream news. There's a particular channel, Channel 4 News, with a guy called Jon Snow, who was very eco-aware, and he would announce things like this at the end of, the newsreel. The white stork has returned to Knepp, and go and interview them. But they've also been ingenious because they've set up campgrounds, and now you can go on a tour, on a safari around the Knepp estate to see how this is working. And so they're trying to make money out of it through inviting people in, which of course is a double whammy. And as a result, not just of that project, but many projects, people are really understanding that this is really important, and people are buying up land left, right and centre in order to rewild and rewilding their gardens.
Yeah.
But the piece that I want to come to really in all of this is that I've seen lots of articles in mainstream mags about rewilding humans. So this is how eco-psychology, amazingly, is coming into mainstream culture.
Right. Okay. Great.
To rewild ourselves.
That's what I was wondering if it would come around to, because as you were saying, leave the land fallow and then replant native vegetation and so forth, and it'll come back to health. And, I was thinking it's the same with us. Like, if we continue to think we have to work in this way, in this factory model, we're just a part of a machine. We're all going to get worn out. It's not going to work. We need to rewild ourselves. And so it kind of has come full circle back to that via this kind of biosystem.
So I would never have guessed that that's how eco-psychology would be entering mainstream culture. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's from the ground up. It's from ecology, and then seeing humans as part of that. And, oh, yes, we are probably too over-domesticated, and we need to rewild ourselves. But what does that actually mean? And I think that is a very important question.
It's a massive question. And of course,
it's a massive question.
Closely allied to the whole process of or uncolonization of ourselves again.
Exactly.
Like over here, we are, or most of the people I work with, European ancestry, living on Aboriginal land that was effectively stolen. I mean, you can cut it lots of different ways, but there was not a fair process that happened here.
Yeah.
And, and so this land is colonized. And in effect, we are internalized that same colonization in the sense that we think, yes, we have to work for the machine, and
we own the land. I mean, there's just so many. I mean, that is so fundamental, isn't it? Owning property and owning land, and owning animals, changing all of that around. Where is the? You hear it constantly. Where is the dog's owner? Or I'm in charge of this land, and it's such a turnaround.
We build a house, we build a property on a piece of land, and then we fence it. And just the other day here, we had a large blue-tongue lizard walking around. Thought she was probably pregnant, quite a big one. Turned out it was. We found a baby living in a corner. Unfortunately, found its skeleton a couple of weeks later, and in a corner of a fence. Now, this is a fence on my property where I live. I'm not happy about this, but that's what happens. I bought this property. It was fenced. All the properties are fenced. Fences do that. They choke them.
It's so interesting, this whole way of thinking, isn't it? And I can't say that I'm, which of us are completely free of it. I keep, it's a bit like an internalized racism. I still catch myself saying things, and I think, oh goodness. So I saw something written on the women's pond where I swim has a Facebook page, and I posted a photograph of a fox. There's a fox who lives in the area of the pond. And someone commented and said, well, yeah, the fox looks very cute, but actually the fox is a terrible nuisance and shouldn't really be allowed in areas that humans are in. And actually, who owns the women's pond? We don't own it. The fox has just as much. Who belongs there? The fox has just as much right to be on that lawn where we are. We just have to make sure we cover our food when we go for a swim, and we cover our clothes, because the fox has a habit of stealing clothes.
Of course, that could lead to very amusing consequences that we'll try not to imagine right now. But that's hilarious. But it's true, when you repersonalize the other citizens, the other beings of an ecosystem, well, I mean, is it the crossing the, and roadkill? We get a lot of roadkill around where I live. It's wide open highways in the countryside. Is it, the animal crossing a road, or is it that we put the road across their territory in the first place?
Exactly.
We got to be responsible for this stuff. But I do argue also for a little self-compassion. I felt really guilty when I found this baby lizard had died in the corner of my property. But also I recognize that we are entirely enmeshed in this global disaster. I mean, there's nothing we can do. I've got solar, I've got water tanks, I've got an electric car. I can do everything I want. The bottom line is I'm enmeshed in the very system that's destroying this planet, and there's absolutely no way I can avoid that entirely, at least. Yeah. Agriculture's taken over most of the countryside too, so that's another thing, that the same rule is applied almost everywhere. We actually have to, I would not have been born into a society that would have caused mass extinction on this planet if I'd had a choice, or I would have been born a corporate CEO who could have changed something about it, or a political leader if I'd had a choice. Some of these things we don't have a choice about, and which if I may, it sort of brings me around to something else that I read in one of your stories that I wanted to ask you about. That And again, this must have been when you were still figuring out, how are we going to do ecotherapy? How am I going to bring nature into this psychotherapeutic practice and relationship that I love so much, that I've seen? Surely, I'm paraphrasing here, but you would have seen a lot of people grow, evolve, liberate from challenges they'd had through psychotherapy. It's done so much. You're going through this process, as the story goes, of working out how to put nature into it. And there's that client you had where you felt like you weren't getting anywhere, and then one day you realize, and you asked her, what do you think about the future? And you quote her, oh, we're completely fucked.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, you're like, oh, I mean, the penny must have dropped. And I think there's a lot more people nowadays who are realizing we are in big trouble out there.
Yeah. No, it was quite a moment, because I had to stop my jaw from falling to the floor.
Yes, you can't be too shocked.
I mean, partly because, this is such an obvious thing to say, and yet there it was, completely buried. And if it hadn't been me as the therapist, I don't suppose anyone, it's not the kind of question that you would normally ask a client. And so how would you discover it? But I do think probably these days things have moved on, and that it's easier for people to access the "we're completely fucked" statement. It's not so buried anymore.
I expect.
Nevertheless, it's a hugely, it's such an existential piece of existential angst to be living with, isn't it? How do we metabolize that? Of course, we don't know that for sure, but we can say things are looking pretty dire.
Well, I think also we have to look back, and we have to imagine for ourselves what it would be like to be young right now. And I think that there's absolutely no doubt in most people right now, if you're 18 to 25, there's no way you are thinking about a future the way I was thinking about a future when I was 18 to 25.
Exactly.
And I've always known how badly we were treating the environment. It's no surprise to me where we're at right now. It's a terrible disappointment, but it's not a surprise. But we still had a future. You were still thinking about what you would be doing in decades' time. You were still thinking about, what you might like to do for work, and whether or not you wanted a family, and so on and so forth. From what I know, I've got nieces, nephews, I've got little kids, but in that age bracket, I know enough people to know that, a lot of them are living for the moment.
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine what it must be like being that age and seeing what's coming, really. And most of them are now awake to what's coming, and it's very frightening.
Yeah.
And as I heard, I listened to a lecture by Stephen Harding, a deep ecologist, last night.
Yeah.
And he said, if you're not depressed and anxious about what's happening, you need to go and see a therapist.
There's something wrong with you.
Brilliant.
That's great. That's Stephen Schumacher, isn't it?
So I think there's a couple of things I want to say really more about this. The "we're completely fucked." How do we live with such uncertainty? Because we don't know how this is going to play out. What, in terms of collapse,
it's not linear.
It's not linear. We don't know, as we have been seeing really in the last few years, floods, fires. We know that there's going to be melting in the Arctic. There are some things that are for sure, but there are lots of other things that just sort of happen randomly, and and of course earthquakes have always happened, but they're probably happening more. So I think the living with uncertainty is a huge challenge, and I think there are lots of things that can help us with that.
Do tell. I mean, because
as I would describe myself as loosely Buddhist. I found a lot of Buddhist philosophy very, very helpful to help me live with uncertainty. I mean, it's a sort of fundamental question within Buddhism, whether we've got the eco crisis ahead of us or not, that we never know what's about to happen. So how do we live more in the now, and recognize there are many things to be ecstatic about in the present moment?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up first, because I caught myself just before I said, oh, I know heaps of young people, they're living in the moment. And of course, there's different ways to live in the moment. Like when you're talking about being awareness of presence and bringing self-aware consciousness to play, there's a lot you can do about living in the moment that, in a sense, something like the climate crisis is almost a gift to a good meditation practice, because it's really forcing you to come into the now. Like, it's part of the problem that we haven't been living that way. But when I'm thinking about, my nephew who's doing lots of drugs to live in the moment, it's not an act of presencing or, or embodied awareness or anything like that. It's actually escapism.
Yes. And I think it's not just a challenge to live with uncertainty. The challenge is, how do you live in the now and include both the ecstasy that is available to all of us in the now, but also to not push aside the grief, and how do the anger and all the multitude of feelings that come and go. And I suppose that the Buddhist practices for me, and it doesn't have to be Buddhist, of just recognizing what's coming through and trying not to be caught in the grip of any one of those things, and not saying, oh, it's all too difficult, I'm just going to go into ecstasy, or it's all too difficult, I'm just going to be stuck in the gloom. We're moving between these things all the time. Every day I move between all of those different positions, and it's quite a challenge, isn't it? The other thing I think the sort of phrase I'm seeing repeated a lot recently is, and I think it comes from the "we're completely fucked," is a real hatred of humans. That we've caused this terrible crisis, that we abuse the earth in so many different ways. The earth would be better off without us. And it's a sort of wipeout gesture, bring on the revolution, get rid of humans. And I think that's very dangerous, because it leads to a form of eco-fascism.
Yes, I could see that.
So it's not that humans are a virus or a cancer. I would say that it's industrial growth culture that's the virus or the cancer, and that humans belong here, that we have a niche, we have a role, we have gifts to offer. And again, that's another one of those huge questions. Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks a lot about that in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She says that it's our gratitude that we have to offer. I was listening to Stephen Harding last night. He was saying that we have love to offer the earth, but we also are offering back to the earth her story, that none of the other species do that. So we have a particular role. I don't know quite what I think our role is or what our gifts are, but I think it's a very, very interesting and very important question, that we acknowledge that we have a place, that we're not this terrible species. We need to, but it's the reciprocity piece that's so important.
Give back.
Looking at what we have to give back, yes. And consumer culture it's so obviously in its name, it's all about taking. How do we give back? Yeah,
beautiful. I think you're right. And in a sense, I've felt quite challenged by this, and I've talked to many people about this. And I definitely have a misanthropic streak. I think anyone looking at climate science would have come across a misanthropic streak down there somewhere. But and I'm not sure I'm even really that much better on the other side of it, because for me now, I forgive humans, but it's almost in a sense, us. I forgive us almost with a sense of sort of forgive them, they know not what they do. It's almost like a sort of a pity. And like I said, I'm not sure that's really much better. But given that that's a very big picture, that's almost like dealing with the modern myth of, the cancer of endless growth and endless consumption and so forth. Easy to deconstruct, extremely difficult to actually disassemble, to dissolve. But I do think at that person to nature level, what we're good for is really important. And yeah, people who know stuff that I trust end up saying things like you've just said, like Robin Wall Kimmerer says, Martin Prechtel in the States says, we're here to sing praise. We're here to...
Lila June Johnson, she's a young Navajo, or calls herself Diné woman, who gave a TED lecture talking about humans as keystone species.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And when we come back to the recognition that we belong, that we are primate life forms in an ecosystem, exactly. We actually, it's to be misanthropic is still to play that same game of separation, really. To think that we could step out and then blame stupid humans. Admittedly, there's a lot that's gone wrong, but in fact, to come back to we belong here and we should be here, and and we have a right. I think we have a birthright to celebrate being self-aware primates and being on a beautiful planet. It's pretty rare, pretty lucky. Then you just do that. For me, the questions actually dissolve a little bit in the practice of spending time in nature, hopefully with some other people that feel the same way, around the circle. All of a sudden, everything's okay. There's some 99% of our genetic evolution was spent doing exactly that. And somehow that memory comes back. And yeah, the questions seem to go away. Like Joseph Campbell pointed out, what a good myth does. Doesn't give you an answer. It just makes the questions go away. Get the belonging back, and you feel that sense of being here and it being right and being in love with the earth.
Yes. And I think that I'm thinking of the Jungian idea of holding the tension of the opposites. That, as I was talking about earlier, the grief and the ecstasy, sometimes it can feel like doing the splits, that you're pulled in one direction or the other. And what we've just been talking about is forgiveness, but also rage. I'm furious with those people that spread the misinformation about climate change, the oil companies in the early days, just like the tobacco companies. That's absolutely outrageous, and they should be taken to court. And at the same time, I feel like sitting in front of consumer culture reminds me of sitting in front of my bulimic client, that it's that they're not able to reach a place of great maturity yet. It's going to take time. And I think our culture is quite an adolescent culture, and it's missing its initiation and rites of passage into a sort of mature adulthood.
Yes.
But I also have some forgiveness of that lack of maturity. Although I suppose I need to own that in myself, because otherwise it can sound a bit like me sitting on high, making a judgment. But
yeah, that's what I meant about myself. It's hardly better than misanthropy, really. But the way that I truly forgive myself for being a little bit presumptuous is I'm doing the work. I'm trying to do the work and say, okay, I can see this is missing. Paul Shepard in Nature and Madness was really big for me to help me to see we'd lost being initiated into nature connection. And so, so the question inevitably comes back. The same question Linda asked about, and you asked about eco-psychology. So what do we do about it? And I think what we do about it is figure out how to do some kind of initiation back into nature connection.
Yes.
And
it's going to look different for different people according to where you live and whether you're in the city or not, and so on. Everyone will have a different way, won't they?
I think so. And I think it'll just be done in the doing. We'll just start walking the path and the path will appear. And all of a sudden, something that was hidden will just, again, you mentioned Jung, these archetypal patterns, they're totally built into us.
Yes.
We're not that far away from, for me, and I'm presuming for yourself, my European ancestors who lived in the Great Forest.
Mm.
Not that far away from them, and that sort of stuff can come back if we just open ourselves to it, have some trust, have some faith, do some practice, step out.
And ceremony. I've recently thought, well, not so recently, but I suppose in the last decade, making ceremony as a way of honouring the other than human world is important.
Great. I feel like I would love to start an entirely new conversation now, which we won't do. But I would love to pick that thread up. So just in case you're ever open to it, how do we do initiation into nature connection, and what kinds of ceremonies? Because all these words have their own nuances. What kind of rites? How are we going to do this stuff? Because I think people, a little bit like ecotherapy, I think people unconsciously have this appetite, this hunger, or not even unconsciously now, more and more people coming to it consciously. And I feel like we need to keep on working away at this stuff and figuring out, like Joanna Macy and John Seed have been doing over the decades, and just saying, okay, how do we start doing this in ways that both tap back into the ancestral traditions that are real, that the ways humans have done it since time immemorial, and speak to people right now in their confused, urbanized, disconnected states.
I think that question, what do we do now, is, it's another one of those really big ones, isn't it? And one of the questions you sent me was, what do you think will be the kinds of ecotherapy that will help us to acclimatize our inner lives with the increasing breakdown of ecosystems, which is an important question, isn't it?
That's a good question. I'm happy with that, but I can't remember sending it. Can you please give me an answer to
it? You want me to respond?
Sure.
Okay.
I would love you to, if you would be so generous.
Well, it's quite a tricky question, actually. What kinds of ecotherapy will help us to acclimatize our inner lives as there's increasing breakdown? Because I'm not sure that it's about the different kinds of ecotherapy. I think for me, there's something really important about attending to the shadow of ecotherapy and making sure that it doesn't get subsumed into a Western worldview. So, for example, some of the dangers I see are how ecotherapy remains for the white privileged.
Nice.
Ecotherapy is spoken about as going out into nature to get healed. So that's falling into a sort of simplistic way of seeing it, and that it just becomes something that we're taking yet again. I want to get healed. So I think that piece of reciprocity is absolutely vital. And then, the really bad stuff is kind of flying halfway across the world to pristine wilderness to detox. Hopefully not that many people are doing that so much. And also
post-COVID, the travel industry seems to be really
going back up again. People are saying, oh, well, I haven't traveled for 3 years, so I'm going to travel 3 times this year, by the way. But anyway, and then the cultural appropriation, taking from other cultures. I mean, of course, we're going to be inspired by all sorts of different cultural ways of doing things, but to take specific ceremonial practices without permission and then charge money for them is one of the dangers. I think I think people are becoming a lot more aware of that. But how do we become a more diverse community? So I think the big question is how we build community, and how ecotherapy doesn't just sort of go down a track of like private practice, how do we actually use the principles of ecopsychology in organizations?
Nice.
You know, there's an amazing project called the Natural Change Project. I don't know if you know of it. My co-facilitator, Dave Key, who's an outdoor educator, he's the person that I worked with for, 15 years, running groups outdoors, starting in Scotland and working in many different places. He initiated the Natural Growth Project with Margaret Kerr, sort of developed from the work that we did together. So we're running 1 week courses with an entire solo day in the center of it. They developed a 6-month course and invited leaders from the community, many of whom weren't aware of green issues. And it was sponsored by a green NGO. And obviously it wasn't just spending time out in the wilds. They also did solos in the city. They also had a lot of information about change and how that happens and change in organizations. And it was incredibly successful, but it was built on ecopsychology principles.
Right.
And how often do we see that happening? It's not very often.
No, that's exciting. I really like to break things down and find core themes and then wonder how that will translate. And that's what I'm hearing that yourself and Dave have been doing. How do we take the core themes of ecopsychology? And for me, I've broken them down to 3, and you've pretty much mentioned them too. We learn from Indigenous wisdom, the wisdom of the elders, and then we make sure we do it in a decolonizing way to whatever extent we can. Awareness paradigms, like for me, meditation in nature is massive, and I get really good results by taking people out and training them to be, to let themselves be in nature. And the depth psychology stuff, what's our story, what's our myth, what modern myth is stopping us from living the ancient myth that
exactly
still deep within us. How do we put those into the way we do things? You've inspired me here. I'm thinking on the hop, but I'm thinking now, the question we just both touched on, so a mutual interest, and I'm definitely very, very motivated about it. Initiation, ritual, ceremony. How are we going to do that in a way that's real? We'll come back to de-privileging it too, because I've got some ideas about that. But yeah, not being a white upper middle class psychotherapy project, but actually doing something that's available for people to reconnect to the earth and to actually have those core principles so that it sings, so that it's got all that ancestral deep connection in it.
Exactly. And I think Joanna Macy, for example, and John Seed, their work was very much about creating spaces in the community for people to honor our pain for the world, for example. And then such imaginative exercises like the Council of All Beings, stepping into the shoes of the other than human world, and Joanna with her anti-nuclear imagination going to a power plant and as a sacred site and recognizing the destruction that it's wrought, but how we can learn from that, seeing all of this as our teacher. So all the ways in which we can bring our psychotherapeutic knowledge as citizens and work in the community. And I think we're seeing that with grief tending circles and climate cafes over here. The work of the Climate Psychology Alliance is really worth looking at because they've been doing a lot in this field.
Fantastic. I am going to follow up a heap of notes here on the one hand. And I think I want to invite you to talk to me again in a certain period of time, because I'm going to go away here. And this is funny, right? I'm right in the middle of the last couple of modules of the ecotherapy course that I teach. And we're right in the patch where we're talking about initiation and ceremony and ritual. And as I said, and I've already introduced to the gang, to the participants, how are we going to do this in a non-colonizing way? How are we going to do this in a way that actually speaks to us modern people, but doesn't lose those core themes? So I've got a live group about to experiment with this. And
Well, one of the things that Dave Key and I felt very strongly about is that we kept our ceremony on those courses very, very simple. So we used to, on the solo day, we used to invite people in silence. We made a little stone circle on the cliff edge, and people would step silently into that circle and then step out of the circle and into their solo day. And then maybe they would leave an object in that circle.
Yeah.
And then when they came back at the end of the day, they would come back to the circle, pick up the object, and then we would know they were back.
Nice.
For example, you know,
I agree with you. Simple is good. I keep things as simple as I possibly can. And sometimes it is just making that space. So you've got your sacred space made out of stones. You don't have to make a really big deal out of it. It simply is. Something changes when you walk in and out of it. You know, we can almost trick ourselves to actually transition from state to state by doing things like that. Nice. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mary-Jayne.
Well, it's lovely to meet you. And I did do a little bit of research on all your work and thought, my goodness, there's so much writing that you've done. I'd love to, you know, you did a thesis on light.
And one of the few regrets I have so far in this primate life, oh boy, I've got to turn that into a book.
Yes, exactly.
It was a tough one, though. It's so obscure. You know, it's taken me a long time. That PhD's over 10 years behind me now. But I dared myself, possibly pushed myself a little too far, but I think I've made it now. I said, when you can explain this to a truck driver, then you're ready to write your book. And I think I've got there. How do we think about light? The way we think about light, does it take us away from being here on Earth?
Yeah.
And it was a fascinating project. Nearly rendered me unemployable, I'd have to say. But I think I've come full circle. So I promise I'll stay in touch. I would very much love to hear more from you about ceremony. Maybe we can... I could give,
if you're interested, I could give you really the person you should interview about ceremony.
Okay, yeah.
Is Annie Spencer.
How do I not know that name? Okay.
Well, she's a real elder, and she's learnt from one Native American culture and the Mayan culture, and is trying to piece that together with our ancient traditions. And she's an extraordinary storyteller, but she doesn't have a big whizzy website, and she does the work more behind the scenes, but she's an amazing ceremonialist.
Well,
and I did a 2-year course on ceremony with her some years ago, but she's the person you should speak to about that.
Okay.
And also, if you're interested in interviewing Dave Key about his work and the Natural Change Project.
I have come across him before. I didn't know the Natural Change Project or Natural Growth Project, I didn't know you'd worked with him, but I've definitely come across his work before and followed it because I knew that he'd worked in Scotland. Look, you know, there's a lot to know, so I don't pretend to know any more than that. But
he's now in New Zealand.
Oh, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, that's ringing a bell too. Okay, anyway, another time.
Exactly.
But I definitely, all right, I'm going to send you a report of how the next month or two goes with me and my group.
Great.
And I have to say, it's interesting that you mentioned stone circles, because I've been thinking hard, or trying not to think too hard, but to sit with, how am I going to do this thing, reintroduce ritual with my people, with the people I'm working with anyway? That can be a malleable concept, the community of souls. But the stone circles came back to me because I spent a year in Ireland, and mostly Ireland. That's because that's where the postdoc was based, but around Wales and all the Celtic lands, the west of France as well. And I spent a lot of time in stone circles and in tombs, and not really knowing what I was doing and what I was looking for, just feeling, just being there and sensing it out. And, you know, and I just think there's something there. What's been simmering to the surface lately has been the connection between those and the mystery religions of ancient Greece. The whole idea of you go down into the earth. And indeed, when my father's from Guernsey, the Norman Islands just off the French coast, and there's some incredible tombs there, old stone tombs. And so I've sat in those for, periods of time. And the feeling of really being enclosed in the earth, in the womb of the earth, it really makes real the rebirth ritual, of like, you get all your highfalutin ideas, humans, but you're born out of the earth.
Yeah.
There's something about that that's really deeply reconnecting, that's mysterious, that's goddess inspired, and nothing against the God, but it's unbalanced, and that just centers you in place. There's something about stone circles that I think I want to work with again.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm on Aboriginal land too, so I don't want to just go out there and build a Celtic stone circle and reproduce that.
So difficult, isn't it? That's so, it's
well,
so
I've got friends I can talk to. I've got Aboriginal friends I can talk to about it, and they're mostly pretty on side with my crazy white man ideas. So we'll see how we go. All right, Mary-Jayne, thank you so much for this really rich conversation.
Great. Well, thank you too. It's really great to meet you.
I hope we can have another one day, and really, really happy for all the work you've done. I'm really glad I've been exposed to it, and you've helped me and lots of people to, to understand better what ecotherapy and eco-psychology can do for us.
Yeah, well, thank you too for all your work. Amazing. It's so exciting, isn't it? That more and more people are getting into this.
Yeah, it's good to be in the work.
Yeah, really is.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Good night to you. Good morning to me.
Indeed.
Thanks for watching, and please consider liking this video. And if you want more content like this, subscribe, and the nature calling bell will toll for you. This is Geoff signing off.